Hello, everyone. My name is Ben Miller. I'm an economist at the RAND Corporation and a professor at the Pardee RAND Graduate School. I do research measuring the value of different intangibles, such as health and well-being, as well as innovation and research more broadly. In this 5-minute presentation, we're going to talk about how we measure well-being. Before we talk about measurement of well-being, I want to start with a story about why we want to measure well-being and how the earliest measures of statistical value of the human life sort of came to be needed. The story starts in 1949. The Soviet Union had just developed its first atomic bomb, and the US Air Force asked RAND for a cost-effective and efficient first strike strategy. The problem is, if you don't have a method for valuing human life, you end up with a rather silly answer. You end up with an answer that says, hey, let's just throw a whole bunch of cheap planes and a bunch will get shot down, but enough will reach the target. That's all right. This is obviously a silly answer because we place some value on all the casualties that would result from that. So since that time, there's been a lot of research and thinking, both at RAND and around the world, about how to incorporate human life and well-being into cost-benefit analysis, because we want to make sure we consider that in the process. So that's why we measure well-being. When we're thinking about measuring well-being, another important question to ask first is what exactly we want to measure. The typical focus is on negative physical impacts. So we're thinking about injuries, illnesses, fatalities. We can also think more broadly beyond physical well-being about mental well-being, and there's going to be other conversations later about that. In addition to these negative aspects, we can also think about the positive aspects of physical well-being, so levels of fitness and happiness. Indeed, the World Happiness Report is now in its 8th edition. In all of these, we want to use all of these different broad measures of well-being to think about, as we're discussing in this broader group, vertical expansion, how we can integrate all of these different measures across the working life of individuals with this focus on well-being. So that's what we want to measure and why we want to measure it. How do we measure it? Well, there's lots of different ways this information gets recorded. Some of it is subjective data. So things like on a scale of 1 to 10, how much pain are you in? These measures can be emotive and approachable to your audience, but the meaning can be unclear and inconsistent. A pain of 4 doesn't necessarily mean the same thing to everyone. It's generally a great starting point, but it's an unsatisfying conclusion because you haven't reached an objective conclusion. Need to marry it with objective data. We're familiar with the quote-unquote administrative data sets such as workers' compensation claim data, data on workplace injuries over time and across industries, and other sorts of data. These data are really well suited for analysis. They're objective. They can be expensive and time consuming to collect, but they help us avoid subjective biases. The problem is they can sometimes, if we only look at those, leave us blind to context. So at the end of the day, we need both of these pieces together. Once you've got some sort of measure of well-being, what do you do with it? Well, the purpose is to guide decisions. We want to think about how we can inform better decisions. We have some new policies, some new process, some intervention that we think might improve well-being, but it's going to cost X dollars. Did the benefits exceed the cost? Well, to make these comparisons, we need two things. First, we need a counterfactual, or without the new intervention, and the ability to compare apples to apples. So it's particularly that second one. How do we compare apples to apples? Costs are in dollars. These measures of well-being are not always in dollars. We need to convert them into dollars to make that comparison. There's generally two ways to do that very broadly. The first is, think of it as direct costs or benefits. This is costs in sort of an accounting sense. You're going to sum up all the medical costs associated with the intervention that are either avoided or experienced, the changes in productivity, and these sort of direct, somebody receives a check type costs and benefits. The challenge with this is that it fails to incorporate sort of consumer surplus measures, so sort of another intangible aspects of value, but sort of reflects the business case of it's the amount I'm spending exceeding the benefit. Sometimes we need to think a lot more broadly than that, which is why we turn to willingness to pay measures. These are an attempt to measure the preference-based measure of value. How much dollars is society going to place towards the gain or lost well-being? How much is it sort of worth to society? These are really widely used measures, and they often come from other studies, so they get determined in the course of other studies. So for example, values of statistical life come from studies that typically form these estimates via extrapolation. How much more would I need to pay a worker in order for them to accept a job with a slightly larger chance of dying or of injuring, of being injured? And then we can extrapolate those values accordingly. Once we have these sort of dollar-based values, you can compare costs and benefits in the same units, think about that counterfactual, and use measures of well-being to inform these decisions. That's the end of our 5 minutes. I'm happy to talk with anyone further about this topic, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the workshop.